This is EksAyn Anderson. Welcome to the Principal Podcast today. So today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things to talk about. We're going to be talking about, well, let me tell you a story. I know of someone who was recently accepted to an Ivy League Masters of Business program. And this is kind of a big deal. Let me tell you what a big deal it is. I did some research. By the way, I did this research several years ago. So the research I'm about to tell you is probably a little bit outdated, but we'll still use it just for the purpose of this conversation. I did some research that showed that 5 years after someone graduated from this particular Ivy League school, that they would make about $285,000 a year. And that seems like that's a pretty good income. I mean, that's $285,000 a year. 5 years after you graduate from this Masters of Business school at this prestigious Ivy League school. And during the same time, I actually looked up to see what the average household in America made. And at that time, it was about $55,000. I think it's more now. So if you take those two numbers, $285,000, and you subtract $55,000, you get about, and I'm going to show you my paper here, you get a difference of about $230,000 a year. So someone makes $285,000 and the next person makes about $55,000. The difference is about $230,000 a year. Well, let's just say that you work another 30 years after that. You know, that may not apply to everybody, but it may apply to some. If you do that 30 years, an additional 30 years at $230,000 more than the next person ends up being about $6.9 million. So you might say that because, you know, someone was accepted to this one particular Ivy League school, that they have a good chance of making $6.9 million more than the next guy. Now, this is really, really simple math, and the math is too simple. I've got to tell you, let me disclaim, these numbers can't be accurate. And let me tell you why they're not accurate. Number one, they're too simple. They don't take into account things like inflation. If you took into account inflation, the number would be much higher than $6.9 million, is my opinion. They do not take into account cost of living. They do not take into account the fact that many people make more. If they're only measuring year 5, I think a lot of people would make more in year 6 and 7 and 10 and 12 and 15 and 30, right? And so generally people's income goes up as they get more adept and as they have more experience and skill. So we're going to use just year 5, and we're not going to take into account inflation. So I realize my numbers are not correct. There's my disclaimer. That being said, they're probably conservative because they're not taking into account those things. The real numbers are probably much higher than 6.9 million. But, you know, I went to this person, great guy, went to him and I said, you know, what did you do to get accepted to this Ivy League school? It was very prestigious. And his answer kind of surprised me. He said something to this effect. Not sure if I'm saying it exactly, but my impression was he said something to this effect. He said, you know, my dad taught me that if I didn't understand something, to not be content with not knowing, to take some time and try to understand it, to look it up. I said, well, that's interesting. So tell me more. He said, well, most of the time how that would work out is I'd be reading a book, you know, for school, and I'd run into a word that I didn't understand. And I'd have to take just a minute or two and go look it up in the dictionary. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that sounds interesting. But somewhere in my mind, at some point, I'm thinking, okay, $6.9 million, look stuff up in the dictionary. Tell me more. And he said, well, what would happen is this. I'd read something in the dictionary and I'd take a minute or two to look it up. And of course, I'd go back to the book I was reading and I now understand what they were talking about. But he said the real magic happened later because I'd hear that same word in conversation, or I'd hear that word on TV, or I'd hear it on, you know, on the radio. And because I'd taken just a little bit of time to learn what the word meant, I now could understand oftentimes what they were talking about. And it became exponential because I'd understand what they were talking about. And then I'd hear something else that was related, and then I could kind of piece it together. And it was this slow growth of like, oh, I get it. Oh, I get it. Just because I would take the time. And, you know, sometimes he said he'd have to look up 10 words, you know, he'd have to look up more than one word. And this kind of, it hit me. And I'm still, but there's somewhere at some point I was thinking, okay, was there anything else you did? I'm thinking, okay, did you take like a crash course? Or did you go to some expensive private school? Did you do something amazing to get, so you could get into this school with such a great GMAT score that you could get in? And so I asked him, I said, was there anything else you did? Something to that effect. And he said something to this effect back. He said, well, I mean, sometimes I had to look stuff up in the encyclopedia. Now, you might find that a little humorous. In his mind, the thing that got him into a prestigious graduate program at an Ivy League university was that growing up, when he didn't understand something, he'd go look it up. He'd go look it up in the dictionary. Now, this thought kind of stuck with me, and it stuck with me for some time. I thought about it again and again and again. I actually went back to him years later and I said, you know what? Shoot straight with me. How much time a day did you spend looking stuff up in the dictionary, looking stuff up? And he said it wasn't much, maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes. And I asked him, what was it on a really bad day? And he said maybe 30 minutes. And after I had this conversation, I did some math, and I thought, let's just assume every day was really a bad day, that it was 30 minutes. And I added up 30 minutes for high school, junior high or middle school, elementary school, even the summers, the vacation time, weekends, even in college, up until you would go and, get through college. And I took 30 minutes a day and added it all up. And then I divided it into $6.9 million. Do you have any idea? I mean, if he's correct, that what really got him into this, and it's coming from him himself. So let's assume that he knows what he's talking about, since he's the one who got into Ivy League school. If he's correct that it was that difference that got him in, and assuming his math, assuming that he used 30 minutes or less, we'll say it's the full 30 minutes. Do you have any idea how much money per hour he was making looking stuff up in the dictionary as, say, a third grader? Any clue? Well, according to my calculations, and I hope they're correct, I've calculated that he was making at least $2,200 or around $2,200 per hour. Now, I think my numbers are low. That might surprise you, that as like a third grader, he would be making $2,200 an hour. Now, here's the thing. Nobody was just sitting there cutting him a check saying, hey, good job, you looked something up in the dictionary for an hour. Here's $2,200. That's not how it worked. How it worked is he looked it up and the payday came later. Now, remember, we're talking about principles here, and this is super important. Remember, when you come in contact with a principle, you can either align with it or you can ignore it. So at the very beginning podcast, the first podcast, we talked about like the principle of gravity. You could align with gravity and build a ski resort or a hydroelectric dam or a skydiving company or a zip line company or bungee jumping outfit. Or you could ignore gravity and you could fall off a cliff and die or get injured. Gravity itself doesn't change. All it changed is, did you respect it and align with it, or did you ignore it to your peril? Now, here's the question here. The technique that this gentleman used was to look stuff up in the dictionary when he didn't understand it. That's the technique. But what was the principle that he was aligning with? Now, sometimes when I tell this story, some people say, well, he was aligning with hard work. He's aligning with education. I think those are great answers. I'm going to use a little different phrase. The principle I think he was aligning with was what I call the law of the harvest. The law of the harvest says, if you plant seeds and you take care of them, you water them, you nurture them, you weed, you make sure that everything's good. Eventually, if you plant them in the springtime, you can actually have crops that grow in the fall. It's a principle that farmers align with all the time. They plant in the spring, they harvest in the fall. One time I was speaking to a number of farmers, and I asked them, can you cheat the law of the harvest. Can you cram for it? Can you cheat it? And they laughed. There's no way. Can you imagine a farmer not planting his or her seeds in the spring and then getting to the end saying, okay, I didn't plant. I forgot. I'm going to plant my corn now. And I'm just going to say, grow, and just try to cram for the harvest. Can you imagine somebody trying to do that? Well, it just doesn't work. So the principle that this gentleman who got into Stanford was aligning with was the law of the harvest. And because he did these little actions every single day, he was able to, at the end, have a good result. But the rewards didn't come till much later. Now, this is a principle that works everywhere. It's just like gravity. Remember when we talked about gravity in the first podcast, we talked about how it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. It's there. You can get to the edge of a cliff and say, I believe I can fly, and jump off. And at that point, gravity still takes over. And unless you have another principle that you're working with, like an aerodynamic principle, with a parachute or a hang glider or something, you could get really injured or killed because you're ignoring or being careless with the principle of gravity. This principle, called the law of the harvest, whether you like it or not, is a real principle, and it's working in your life, whether you believe it is or not. Even if I don't believe in gravity, it's still there. Even if I don't believe in the law of the harvest, it's still there. Now, why would I tell you this story? Well, I'm going to tell you why. You may not think that your little tiny daily decisions matter, but I'm here to tell you that your little tiny daily decisions are everything. You may not think, if somebody told you, if you don't know a word, you should look it up. And you might say, well, that makes sense. I should look it up. You're right. But you don't know how right or how much difference that could make. The fact that looking stuff up in the dictionary might make you millions of dollars. I mean, we guess 6.9 million. The truth is probably closer, if you take, depending on the inflation rate, it could be 10 or 15 or $20 million or more, depending on what inflation ends up being. That looking stuff up in the dictionary, at least according to the guy I talked to, had a massive, massive, massive effect. So when we talk about these little principles that we're talking about on the Principle podcast, like, for example, there was one we talked about on the first one. It was positively reinforce people, align with the golden rule, treat others like you want to be treated. You might think, well, that makes sense. Just kind of like looking stuff up in the dictionary makes sense. But just like it made way more sense than you'd recognize with the gentleman who got accepted to an Ivy League school. Catching people doing something right, that little, doing it consistently, might save your marriage, might save a troubled teen from committing suicide. I'm not guaranteeing it will. It might triple your income. And again, I'm not promising that, but I'm saying those little tiny daily decisions over time make all the difference. Your little tiny daily decisions, the ones you think don't matter. Like, am I going to get up an hour early? Am I going to exercise? Am I going to look stuff up in the dictionary? Am I going to catch my spouse or my children doing something right today? Or am I going to just continually point out their negative things? These seem like small decisions, but they're not. They're huge. I've always thought, well, not always, I've learned that the key to success isn't usually in some big thing. The key to success, I think, is number one, being humble enough to realize that you aren't a principle unto yourself. Number two, trying to figure out honestly, what are the principles? I'll give you a hint. They're not the latest fad. They're not the newest book. They're not the latest podcast. They're not something new out there. These principles are ancient. They're timeless. Like the principle of gravity, they've been around a long time. And then making your little tiny daily decisions align with them. And when you do that, and I can feel tingles as I'm saying this, you have so much power behind you because you have timeless ancient principles that are as real as strict gravity, that are strong as gravity, helping you rather than trying to fight something that's much bigger than you or ignoring something that's much bigger than you. If you can figure out what those principles are and then align with them, you'll notice that things go a lot better. And I'm a true believer in Jesus Christ, who I think if you study his words, you will find the real principles that are really there. Thanks for listening to the Principle Podcast today. We hope you join us again soon. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. So glad you joined. I am on a mission to help as many marriages and families and parents learn the principles and techniques that are going to help their marriages be better. And one thing I know about you, there are so many of you listening right now that have tips, that have techniques, that if you would just share them with the community, it could help. So please share them with the rest of us. Share them with me. Would love to hear them. Like, comment, subscribe, rate, review. Let's do everything we can to help as many marriages as possible. You know, I'm a huge believer that a wise man, Neil A. Maxwell, said, if we don't fix marriages and families, everything else we do will be like straightening deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm sure I didn't quote that right, but it was something to that effect. Let's go to the root of the problem and help marriages and families. Feel free to follow me on social media. Most importantly, learn to follow Jesus Christ, who is the principal giver. And let's share as much as we can with each other to make this a great community where we can help people. Thanks again for joining.